Okay, let's dive right in. Picture this. You're sitting right there in Oma's kitchen. Kesser and Steen are there too.
Hmm.
There's cake, definitely cake, tea. And they're having this friendly little debate about onions.
Yeah, and it really gets to a question lots of gardeners have, doesn't it? How do onions actually, start? How do they get going?
Exactly. And Steen, he seems pretty set on this idea he got from a book somewhere.
Right, that you set onions, like you plant the little bulbs, not sow them from seed.
Yes. And then Oma, who just knows things, doesn't she? She casually hands him a bag of onion seeds.
You can almost see the wheels turning in Steen's head, like seeds for onions, but potatoes have seed potatoes, but onions. It sort of clashed with his mental model.
Totally. So our mission today really is to get you up to speed quickly on what's actually going on with growing onions, whether you're already gardening or just, curious.
And Oma, well, she just cuts right to the chase, doesn't she, with that brilliant line, Ingen frö uden en blomst, basta.
No seeds without a flower, period.
Exactly. And that simple fact, well, it unlocks the whole thing about the onion's life cycle, especially when we're talking about making seeds. It's typically a 2-year process.
Okay, 2 years. So year one is
What?
building the bulb.
That's it. Year 1 is all about vegetative growth. The plant is just focusing energy on making that bulb underground. The onion we actually want to chop up for dinner later in the autumn.
Right, the familiar kitchen onion.
Precisely. But here's the interesting part for you listening. If you were to just leave that onion in the ground over winter,
Which we usually don't.
right, which we usually don't, but if you did, it would start year 2. And that's the generative phase. That's when it wants to reproduce.
Okay, generative.
Mm-hmm.
So flowers.
Yes, it bolts, sends up a flower stalk. The actual onion part might get a bit tough, not as good for eating maybe. And then crucially, it flowers.
So back to Oma's point. No flower, no seeds.
You got it.
So the reason our onions, the ones we grow to eat, don't usually make seeds is just because we pull them out before they even get a chance to start year 2.
That's generally it. We harvest them at the end of year 1. End of story for that onion, usually.
But sometimes they do bolt in the first year, right?
Yeah.
What causes that? The book mentioned something.
Yes, they can bolt prematurely. It seems things like unexpected cold weather after they've started growing, or maybe a sudden drought.
Yeah.
Things that stress the plant.
Stress triggers it.
It seems so. It's like the plant gets a signal, whoa, conditions are tough, maybe I won't survive to year 2. So it kind of panics and rushes into flowering and making seeds early.
Which isn't great if you want a big fat onion bulb, I guess.
No, because the energy goes into that flower stalk instead of the bulb. But a flowering onion isn't always a bad thing. Oma actually lets some of hers flower on purpose.
Oh, that sounds interesting. Why would she do that?
Well, this is where it gets really clever. Think about garden ecology. Those onion flowers, they produce pollen.
Okay.
And that pollen is like high-octane fuel, jet fuel, the source called it, for beneficial insects.
Beneficial insects like ladybugs, lacewings.
Exactly. The predators, the ones that eat the aphids and other pests that might be munching on your other vegetables.
Wow. Okay. So Oma's using her flowering onions as like a natural pest control hub.
Pretty much. She's feeding the good guys, basically, drawing them into her garden. It's really smart, integrated gardening.
That is smart. And then I suppose those flowers eventually make seeds.
They do. Once they're pollinated, they'll develop seeds. And Oma, being Oma, she can then collect those seeds.
And plant them next year.
Yep. Closing the loop. It becomes the self-sustaining cycle right there in her own garden, saving seeds from her own plants.
Which brings us back to the whole seeds versus sets thing that confused Steen initially.
Right. So we've talked about growing from seed. The alternative is using stieklig, that's the Danish term, or onion sets.
Which are the little baby onion bowls you buy.
Exactly. They're small, immature onions, basically harvested partway through their first year and stored. You plant these in the spring. It's like giving them a head start.
Okay, that makes sense. Like garlic cloves.
Huh?
You'd plant a clove, which is part of the bulb.
Sort of similar, yeah. Though garlic has its own specific needs, like needing a cold period to properly divide into cloves. But with onion sets, planting that little bulb gives you a quicker start than a tiny seed.
But there's a catch, isn't there? Something about bolting.
Yes, that's the potential downside. If you plant those sets too early in the spring, especially if you then get a cold snap.
Uh-oh. Stress again.
Exactly. Those sets, having already had part of a season and then a storage period, seem to be more sensitive to that cold trigger. They're more likely to bolt prematurely compared to onions grown directly from seed that same spring.
So sowing seeds directly in the garden, like Oma does, might actually reduce the risk of them bolting early.
That seems to be the idea Oma puts forward. The seedlings experience the whole spring cool down gradually, right from the start, which seems to make them less prone to that panic bolting.
It's subtle, but it makes a difference. And Oma also made a point about language, didn't she? About sowing versus planting.
She did, gently correcting Steen. You sow seeds, but you plant sets or seedlings.
Seems a bit picky.
Well, maybe a little, but it reflects understanding the difference, knowing whether you're starting with genetic material in a seed coat or a partially grown plantlet. Oma jokes some people might be a bit divine lazy with the words.
Okay. But using the right word does show you grasp what you're actually doing.
It really does. It ties back to understanding the life cycle, the propagation method. Are you initiating growth from seed, or are you transplanting something already growing? It affects timing, expectations, everything.
Got it. And one last thing, Oma mentioned heirloom varieties. What exactly does that mean in this context?
Good question. Heirlooms are basically older varieties of vegetables, onions in this case, that have been passed down often through families or communities for generations.
So not the modern hybrids you might see everywhere.
Generally not. The key thing is they are usually open-pollinated, which means if you save the seeds from an heirloom onion flower,
Like Oma does.
right, and you plant those seeds, you'll get onions that are essentially the same as the parent plant. They breed true to type, unlike many modern hybrids where the saved seed might give you something quite different or less vigorous.
Interesting. So there's a history and a reliability there.
Yeah, often a story too, and they contribute to genetic diversity, which is important. Plus, they might be really well suited to the local climate where they were developed.
Okay, let's pull this all together then. Back in Oma's kitchen, metaphorical cake in hand,
Cake.
we figured out that onions aren't just annuals we harvest, they can be biennials, with a 2-year cycle to make seeds.
Yep, even if we usually interrupt that cycle by harvesting in year 1.
And we know the difference now between sowing seeds, maybe less bolting risk, and planting sets, which gives a head start but needs careful timing.
And we learned why Oma might actually want some onions to flower not just for seeds, but to feed those helpful insects, the garden's little helpers.
It really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? It's not just about instructions like plant this here. Understanding the why the plant's life cycle, the potential for bolting, the role of flowers, it makes you a much more aware gardener.
Absolutely. It gives you that deeper layer of understanding, which ultimately helps you make better decisions for your own garden, whatever its size. You grasp the biology behind the practice.
It really connects you more to what's happening. So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Maybe while picturing that slice of Oma's cake.
Always good to end with cake.
Right. Thinking about your own connection to food, or maybe your garden patch, or even just a pot on the balcony. What's the balance for you between getting that immediate harvest, the onion you need for tonight's soup, and appreciating the longer game, the whole cycle, the flowers, the seeds, the beneficial insects, the stuff that happens when we let nature take its course a bit more? Something to ponder. Okay, let's dive right in.